You don't own the trees, Mr. Cole. You only own the dirt beneath them. That was what HOA President Vivian Mercer told me, while 20 logging trucks idled outside the north gate of my redwood forest. Behind her, TimberCore workers were painting bright red X's across trees that had been standing for centuries. One of them had marked the grove where I scattered my wife's ashes. Vivian raised a leather folder and announced that the HOA had sold the logging rights for $14.8 million. Then she ordered me to unlock my gate. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten the crew. I simply photographed every page in her folder, including a permit carrying a landowner signature I had never written. What Vivian didn't know was that I had spent 32 years surveying timber boundaries, tracing easements, and reading the kind of documents she had just tried to use against me. 48 hours later, a federal judge froze every permit connected to the operation. But the forged signature wasn't the worst thing we found. At 5:40 that morning, the sound of diesel engines rolled through the valley and shook the windows of my cabin. I pulled on my boots, climbed into my old Ford, and drove toward the north gate. 20 logging trucks were lined up along the gravel road. Behind them sat a tracked cutting machine, its steel arm raised over the cab like a hooked finger waiting to close. 3 TimberCore workers were already inside my fence. They had crossed almost 400 feet onto my property and painted red X's across the trunks of the largest redwoods. Then I noticed the cedar marker beside the western grove. That was where I had scattered Claire's ashes 2 years earlier. Vivian Mercer stood outside the gate in polished boots, holding a leather folder against her chest. She looked at my faded truck, my muddy jacket, and then at me, as though I were a caretaker who had forgotten his place. "This operation has already been approved," she said. "The association controls vegetation management throughout the ridge." She opened the folder and showed me a contract worth $14.8 million. I turned to the final page. Under the words landowner authorization, someone had written my name and copied a signature that was supposed to be mine. I photographed every page before Vivian could close the folder. The signature looked convincing from a distance, but it was too smooth. Whoever created it had traced an older version of my signature from county tax records, including a broken downward stroke I had stopped using years earlier. "That isn't mine," I said. Vivian barely blinked. "Our attorneys verified the authorization," she replied. "If you interfere, you'll be obstructing an approved wildfire mitigation project." I told the TimberCore foreman to remove his crew from my property until ownership and access rights could be verified. Vivian called the sheriff. Deputy Maria Alvarez arrived 12 minutes later with her body camera running. Vivian immediately accused me of blocking emergency access and endangering the entire Cedar Ridge community. Maria entered the permit number into the computer inside her patrol vehicle. "It's active," she said quietly. That was the moment I understood how far Vivian had taken this. The forged signature wasn't sitting on a single private contract. It had been entered into the county system and used to secure multiple government approvals. I handed Maria my deed and asked her to record every page. Then I stepped back and let everyone keep talking. Vivian's first mistake was assuming my old truck told her everything she needed to know about me. I was 61, recently retired, and living alone in a cedar cabin near the western boundary of the forest. For 32 years, I had worked as a forest surveyor and wildfire mitigation consultant. I knew how to read timber deeds, trace access easements, compare recorded maps, and recognize when someone had moved a boundary marker. Claire had understood that work better than anyone. Before cancer took her, she spent years helping protect old-growth redwoods from careless development. Buying this forest had been the final plan we made together. After she died, I sold our larger home and used most of the money to purchase all 2,800 acres. Vivian saw muddy boots, a faded jacket, and a man who rarely attended community meetings. She never asked why I had surveyed every boundary within a month of closing. That afternoon, I returned to my cabin, spread my field maps across the table, and compared them with recent satellite images. A new gravel road crossed the eastern ridge. According to my recorded survey, the HOA had pushed that road more than 300 feet onto my land. The reason for the road became clearer when I obtained the minutes from an emergency HOA meeting held 3 weeks earlier. Vivian had filled the Cedar Ridge Community Hall with photographs of neighborhoods destroyed by wildfires in other counties. She warned the residents that Cedar Ridge could be next. Then she introduced what she called a comprehensive hazard reduction plan. At first, the plan sounded reasonable. Dead brush would be cleared, fire lanes would be widened, dangerous trees near homes would be removed. What Vivian never told the residents was that most of the proposed work would take place inside my forest, far beyond the HOA boundary. She claimed the logging revenue would lower their insurance premiums and eliminate a looming special assessment. The board approved the agreement after a closed discussion that lasted less than 20 minutes. Buried beneath several pages of safety language, I found one sentence in the meeting minutes. Commercial timber proceeds will be applied against association liabilities. That wasn't wildfire prevention. Cedar Ridge had already promised trees it didn't own to cover money it didn't have. And according to the contract in Vivian's folder, TimberCore had purchased $14.8 million worth of redwood before a single resident had been shown the deed. The next morning, I drove to the county records office and requested every document connected to the Eastern Ridge. Helen Cho had managed the archive for nearly 20 years. After searching through several old property files, she brought me a faded folder labeled Emergency Fire Access and Vegetation Management Easement, 1987. The document gave Cedar Ridge one narrow right. During an active fire emergency, authorized vehicles could use a 20-foot corridor across the property. It did not give the HOA ownership of the road. It did not create permanent access. And it said nothing about commercial timber rights. Then Helen turned to page 8. The final paragraph had been underlined in the original filing. No commercial harvesting, sale, assignment, or transfer of timber rights is authorized under this easement. I placed Vivian's copy beside the county record. Her version ended at page 7. The recording number had also been altered by one digit, making the easement appear connected to a later property filing. Helen checked the archive log, then frowned. 3 months earlier, Vivian Mercer had personally requested a certified copy of the complete 8-page easement. She had seen the restriction. She knew exactly what the missing page said. And someone had removed it before the document reached TimberCore, the county permit office, and the HOA board. I sent Vivian a formal cease and desist that afternoon. Attached to it were the complete 8-page easement and my recorded boundary survey. She replied within an hour. Her email accused me of delaying an emergency safety project and warned that the HOA would fine me $5,000 for every day I blocked access. My property wasn't even inside Cedar Ridge. The following morning, Vivian returned with 2 HOA security officers and a TimberCore supervisor. They walked past the private property signs and began pulling up survey stakes along the Eastern Ridge. I watched from inside my truck. I didn't confront them. I didn't touch their equipment. I let the trail cameras record every face, every vehicle, and every conversation. Vivian pointed toward the ridge and told the supervisor, "The association controls everything east of this line." The line she indicated was more than 300 feet inside my forest. That evening, I downloaded the footage, saved copies in 3 separate locations, and started a timeline containing every notice, permit, email, photograph, and false statement. One camera had captured Vivian speaking to the TimberCore foreman after everyone else walked away. "Start cutting Monday," she said. "Once the first trees are down, no judge will put them back." That gave me less than 36 hours. I spread TimberCore's logging map across my kitchen table and placed my survey beside it. 3 temporary roads had been drawn across the eastern slope. On the contractor's map, they looked like harmless access routes. On mine, every one of them crossed a protected creek. The largest creek ran through a nesting area Claire had helped document years earlier. I still had the habitat report, the photographs, and the recorded coordinates from that survey. But the permit application Vivian submitted declared that no protected habitat existed anywhere near the proposed operation. I called Dr. Leah Bennett, the wildlife biologist who had prepared the original report. She remembered the site immediately. More importantly, she remembered sending the same report to Cedar Ridge after the HOA requested environmental information for its wildfire plan. Vivian couldn't claim she had never seen it. Leah emailed me the delivery receipt, the complete report, and a signed statement confirming that the HOA had been warned about the protected creeks before it applied for the permits. That changed the case. This was no longer just a private boundary dispute. The logging plan relied on false environmental declarations and threatened habitat protected under federal law, and TimberCore was scheduled to begin cutting in less than 36 hours. Before sunrise, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Daniel Reeves, the property attorney who had handled my closing. I sent him the deed, the complete easement, and the survey showing Cedar Ridge's road inside my boundary. The second call was to Sarah Kim, a federal environmental attorney Daniel trusted. She asked for the habitat report, the false permit application, the altered easement, and proof that cutting was about to begin. The third call went to Deputy Alvarez. I asked Maria to preserve the body camera footage from the gate, including Vivian's contract and every statement she had made about owning the timber rights. By noon, Sarah had assembled the emergency filing. We had the original deed, the missing 8th page, trail camera footage, altered records, protected creek maps, and a permit carrying my forged signature. But evidence alone wasn't enough. To stop the operation immediately, Sarah had to prove that the damage would be irreversible before a normal hearing could take place. Then TimberCore's purchase agreement gave us the final piece. The company had already resold part of the redwood shipment to a buyer outside the state. The first trees had to come down Monday morning for TimberCore to meet its delivery schedule. At 4:52 that morning, I heard diesel engines climbing the road toward my gate. By 5:10, all 20 logging trucks were lined up outside. Their headlights cut through the morning fog. The tracked cutting machine sat behind them with its engine running. Beyond the fence, hundreds of red X's glowed against the dark redwood trunks. Vivian arrived in a white SUV with 2 board members and a local television crew. She stepped in front of the camera and announced that one uncooperative landowner was preventing Cedar Ridge from completing an emergency wildfire project. Then she ordered the TimberCore foreman to cut my lock. I stood on the other side of the gate with my deed in one hand and my phone recording in the other. I didn't block the county road. I didn't threaten the crew. I simply told the foreman that every machine crossing that fence would be entering disputed private property under a forged authorization. Deputy Alvarez arrived before the bolt cutters touched the chain. Vivian handed Maria the active permits and demanded that I be removed. I handed Maria the original deed, the complete 8-page easement, and Sarah's federal case number. For several minutes, nobody moved. 20 engines idled while the television camera recorded Vivian insisting that no court would interfere with a public safety operation. Then my phone rang. Sarah told me the federal judge had accepted our emergency petition and scheduled a hearing for that morning. Vivian smiled when I gave her the news. "No federal judge is stopping this," she said. She was about to make the same claim under oath. The emergency hearing began shortly after 9. Sarah stood beside me at the federal courthouse. Vivian appeared by video from the Cedar Ridge office with the HOA attorney and 2 board members. Her attorney argued that delaying the operation would expose hundreds of homes to wildfire. He presented the 7-page easement, the active permits, and Vivian's sworn declaration that Cedar Ridge had exercised vegetation management rights for decades. The judge turned to Vivian. "Does the association possess commercial timber rights?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "Those rights are clearly established in the recorded easement." Sarah placed the county's certified copy on the screen. 8 pages. She opened the final page and enlarged the last paragraph until everyone could read it. "No commercial harvesting, sale, assignment, or transfer of timber rights is authorized under this easement." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Helen Cho testified that the county's original filing had always contained 8 pages. She also confirmed that Vivian had requested a certified copy 3 months earlier. Vivian claimed TimberCore must have misplaced the final page. Sarah then displayed the altered recording number, followed by the scan data recovered from the versions submitted with the permit applications. That digital file had been created at the Cedar Ridge office after Vivian received the complete document. Next came the landowner authorization. I testified that I had never signed it, never approved the logging operation, and never transferred a single timber right. The judge studied Vivian's image on the screen. "Mrs. Mercer, where exactly did you obtain the authority to sell trees you never owned?" Vivian looked toward her attorney. He had no answer. Sarah began closing her folder, but the judge stopped her. "Counsel, I want to see every permit this association obtained using that authorization, not merely the principal logging permit." That was when Vivian finally stopped smiling. Sarah opened the remaining permit files one by one. Every application relied on the same forged landowner authorization. The road permit placed TimberCore's access routes hundreds of feet away from their actual locations. The environmental declaration erased all 3 protected creeks. Another filing stated that Cedar Ridge had no financial relationship with the logging contractor. Sarah then displayed the corporate records showing that Vivian's brother held a controlling interest in TimberCore. The judge had seen enough. He issued an emergency temporary restraining order covering the entire project. No tree could be cut. No truck could enter my property. No machine could cross the boundary. And none of the permits connected to Cedar Ridge's logging plan could be used until the court determined who had altered the records and forged my signature. The order also required the HOA to preserve its computers, emails, contracts, and financial accounts. Deputy Alvarez received a copy while the trucks were still waiting outside my gate. She printed the order from her patrol vehicle and taped it directly onto the cutting machine. One by one, the engines shut down. Then Sarah received a notice from the financial examiner. $420,000 had already been transferred from the logging deal to a consulting company connected to Vivian's family. This was no longer just about stolen trees. The court order gave investigators access to Cedar Ridge's contracts, board emails, and financial records. Within days, the real reason for the logging deal became clear. The HOA reserve fund was missing nearly $2 million. Vivian had concealed the shortage by delaying repairs, moving expenses between accounts, and promising the board that timber revenue would make everything whole. TimberCore had agreed to pay Cedar Ridge what it called a wildfire mitigation contribution. But $420,000 had already been routed through a consulting company controlled by Vivian's brother. The former HOA treasurer, Mark Ellis, came forward with emails showing that he had questioned the arrangement months earlier. Vivian removed him from the finance committee and told the board he was creating unnecessary panic. At the next community meeting, Sarah projected the records onto the same screen Vivian had once used to frighten residents with wildfire photographs. The missing 8th page appeared first, then my forged signature, then the altered creek maps, finally the payments to Vivian's family. Vivian called the evidence a series of clerical errors, but the residents were no longer listening. 2 federal investigators entered through the rear doors and asked the board to surrender its computers and financial files. The woman who claimed she was protecting property values had tried to sell a forest she never owned to hide money her own board couldn't account for. Within 3 weeks, TimberCore canceled the logging contract and began removing its equipment from the ridge. The company's insurers refused to cover work authorized through forged documents. Cedar Ridge was ordered to pay the initial restoration costs, my legal fees, and the damage caused by the unauthorized road. Crews returned to stabilize the exposed soil, rebuild the creek crossings, and remove the gravel that had been pushed across my boundary. Then volunteers arrived to clean the red paint from the trees. Some marks disappeared easily. Others had soaked deep into the bark, leaving faint scars that would remain for years. Vivian was removed as HOA president before the next board meeting. The financial investigation continued, and the evidence connected to the forged permits was referred for criminal review. I didn't attend the vote. Instead, I walked back to the western grove and stopped beneath the redwood where I had scattered Claire's ashes. The red X was gone. Sunlight came through the branches in the same narrow beams she used to photograph when we first visited that hillside together. They had tried to put a price on the final promise I made to her. But the machines were gone. The gate was still locked, and every tree around me was still standing. Cedar Ridge elected a new board before the end of the month. For the first time in years, residents were allowed to inspect the association's contracts, bank statements, and meeting records without submitting formal requests. An independent audit was ordered, and every agreement connected to Vivian's administration was reviewed. The new board adopted a simple rule. Cedar Ridge could not claim, manage, lease, or sell anything beyond land the association actually owned. It was a rule that should never have been necessary. Several residents came to apologize. Most had believed Vivian because she spoke confidently, used official language, and always carried a folder filled with documents. They had never stopped to ask whether those documents were complete. I didn't join the HOA, and I never opened the forest to development. Instead, I created the Claire Cole Redwood Trust. A small section near the Southern Trail became an outdoor classroom where local students could learn about forest ecology, wildfire prevention, and the difference between responsible management and commercial destruction. We also started a forest restoration program for veterans. Some came to repair trails, others monitored streams or removed invasive plants. A few simply sat beneath the trees because silence was what they needed most. The residents of Cedar Ridge helped restore the damaged creek banks. They planted native ferns where TimberCore had cleared brush and rebuilt the boundary signs Vivian's crew had removed. Vivian had a title, a board, active permits, and a $14.8 million contract. I had a deed, 8 complete pages, a few cameras, and the patience to let her keep talking. The forest never needed revenge. It only needed the truth recorded in the right place, and one judge willing to read the final page. So tell me this. If 20 logging trucks arrived at your gate carrying permits with your forged signature, would you stand in the road and try to stop them yourself? Or would you step back, turn on the cameras, and let them create the evidence that destroyed their entire operation?